About 380,000 kilometers away, a small rocky body orbits our planet. This object was always the most important landmark of the night sky for all life on Earth. Our ancestors told many stories revolving around this object. They could have only dreamed of ever reaching it, however. Chances are that, without this object, we wouldn't even exist. Fast forward to the 20th century, a time period where humans went from wood and cloth flying machines to rockets and spaceships that would escape the Earth's atmosphere and reach places no other life on Earth has ever ventured to. Or did we? Could it really be possible for one of our greatest achievements ever to have been faked? Let's take a closer look. At 4:17 PM on July 20th, 1969, everyone was watching closely as the first instance of man stepping onto another body in space took place and was televised internationally. Neil Armstrong, the first man on the moon, then said his famous line,
"It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Oh, that looks beautiful.
Since then, 12 more astronauts have walked on the moon, finally putting an end to the Apollo missions by 1972. But ever since the Apollo missions have ended, there have been an increasing amount of people that deny moon landings ever happened. I'd say there are two main groups of people that deny the moon landings. One of these groups of people claim to have legitimate evidence and reasons for their conclusion. The other is the space-denying, pancake Earth believing kind. We're going to ignore those clowns for now, and only focus on the real and serious arguments made by legitimate skeptics. It's not like these skeptics are incapable of researching this stuff themselves, however, but I do want to compile everything into one video and tidy up confusing and messy arguments and points of evidence. If you think I missed something in this video, please contact me with the following email address, and I'll be sure to respond in about 17.569 working days. On with the video then. Firstly, we have to look at the motives for a conspiracy to be concocted by the US government here. Surprisingly, there's no shortage of reasons here. For starters, the US was involved in a pretty important space race against the Soviet Union, where the whole world was watching both players very closely. Any victory here, no matter how small, was important. The Soviets had already one-upped the Americans by sending the first man into space, amongst other achievements where they beat the Americans. The US had to catch up to avoid falling too far behind in this crucial new frontier. The whole world was watching. This entire space thing could mean the difference between dominance and defeat for these superpowers. And then there was the declining public image of the government, after failing to accomplish anything significant in the Vietnam War. On the other hand, faking an event this massive, which involved thousands of people, some of which were KGB spies that reported everything back to Moscow, is a risk no government would take. It would be impossible to hide this. The logistics of such a conspiracy, especially in the 1960s, just don't make sense. Especially since they went back to the moon several times after Apollo 11. Even the best CGI and stages at the time couldn't simulate something like the surface of the moon. They'd have to simulate the exact behavior of dust in a place with a sixth the Earth's gravity and no air resistance, and then superimpose that on video footage of the astronauts walking around and doing things. A simple slow-mo effect just wouldn't cut it. Even with modern CGI and computer simulations, it would be a monumental task, and you'd still be able to distinguish it from reality. Just about. Now, let's look at some interesting arguments for the moon landings being faked. Some you might have heard of, others not so mainstream, but nevertheless, still interesting. In the Apollo 16 missions, one of the astronauts jumps and salutes the camera, an innocent enough gesture. But as he does this, a flap of fabric appears to come loose and is visible above the astronaut's head. In another shot taken from a different angle, however, no such flap is visible, which seems to suggest that these videos were pre-recorded and perhaps required multiple takes. This sure is an interesting little observation, but does it hold up to scrutiny? We'll see. A somewhat popular question in the moon landing denialist sphere is the presence of this bizarre and out of place letter C, as seen here on this moon rock. Apparently, this is all connected to Hollywood, which use this letter to show where the center of the scene is, or something like that. So, this could point to it being a movie set. Who knows? Another popular alleged anomaly has to do with the angles of shadows cast on the lunar surface, or the Hollywood set, if these arguments end up being undebunkable. In this photo here, for example, one of the astronauts' shadows is longer than the other astronaut's shadow, despite them standing only a few feet apart. Moon landing recorded on a film set confirmed? Perhaps. Another shadow-related point is the way that the astronauts are clearly lit up in this image, despite facing away from the sun. Surely he should just be a shadowy figure if the sun is behind him, right? And take a look at this image. Look at the angle of the shadows. Suspicious, right? How come the shadows go in two different directions if there's only one source of light? Surely they should look more like this. In this photo here, we can see what appears to be an antenna coming out of Buzz Aldrin's life support system. However, in a photo taken just a few seconds later, it's no longer there. Did NASA mess up between different takes or shots of their big conspiracy perhaps? The first picture shows a close-up shot of the lunar module, with a not so large mountain behind it. But this other picture shows the same lunar module in the same position, only further away now. But side by side, we can see that the mountain in the second picture, which is supposed to be the same mountain, is much larger. Odd, isn't it? What about them? Well, conspiracy theorists are already quite familiar with this argument. Essentially, this argument states that it's impossible for man to travel through the Van Allen radiation belts, claiming that it's lethal. Other radiation in outer space would also be lethal to our astronauts, so traveling to the moon would literally be impossible, forcing NASA to fake it. We should hear the lunar module's descent engine firing in the radio transmissions during the landing, but we don't. How come? Now, there are other arguments which you may have heard of, like the waving flag, but they've all been covered and explained so many times that it'd be a waste of time to go over them again. But I might throw one in anyways, just because I'm just so nice. Right then, so now for the explanations. Okay, so let's start with the first question here. The mysterious flap. Now, the people behind this question also claim that this flap of fabric flopping around is dangerous, as well as being suspicious, because of the inconsistency in the photos, of course. They think that space travel needs to be absolutely perfect and flawless for it to work. Well, like everything humans do, it's not perfect and it's not flawless, and sometimes things get a little janky here and there, especially considering how primitive all this technology was compared to some of the stuff that came out later on. So these guys were pioneers, they were explorers, they were the first to ever undertake such a task. And as we know, there are bound to be some flaws or imperfections or things they forgot to do. And this small flap of fabric was actually thermal protection for the OPS, so it's actually okay for this to flop about a bit. It wasn't that dangerous or that much of a problem. I mean, these astronauts have to adapt to new situations on the fly. Now, as for the discrepancy in the two photographs, can we explain that? Well, as it turns out, yes. There's a very simple explanation, and it's got everything to do with perspective. If we look at this image here, we can see this same triangular looking flap. And this is a different photo from the original one that was pointed at. And now that we notice that this triangular flap on the PLSS is centered on the OPS case, but the object in the jump salute photo is not centered. It's off-center to the astronaut's right. If we examine some other photographs in the first EVA, we find several that show John Young sporting a triangular object on his OPS. If we enlarge the section in question and note how the shadow falls behind and to the left of the photo, corresponding to the sunlight angle, we conclude that the object is indeed attached to the front of the OPS. If it had been the protective cloth flap instead, it would be sticking up from the back of the OPS where it folds over from the back panel. It would be impossible for the flap to cast a shadow like we see in this photo here. So in conclusion, what we're actually seeing in these photos are two different flaps from different angles. One of them that's meant to be there, and the other one that isn't and flaps up and down, which can also be seen in some videos that they took. And in the videos we can see this object flapping back and forth as Young jumps and salutes. This picture here should help clarify things, where we can see the top of the OPS with the various flaps and panels which comprise the top surface there. And the object in the photos above can be clearly identified as a triangular flap attached to the front edge. Now, despite me telling you that these photos were taken at the same time, it also has to be pointed out that these two cameras were different. What do I mean by that? Well, one was a still camera and the other was a motion picture camera. So, yeah, I'd say this one has been debunked. Moving on to the next one then. I'd say this one is a little bit more famous, and chances are that you've probably come across it at some point, or you've heard of it before. Now, the explanation for this one is quite simple actually, and with a little extra research, just about anyone can debunk this quite easily. Now, for starters, the claim that this is some sort of Hollywood prop marking that is commonly used in movies, well, it isn't. No movie producer would have a prop marking be this visible in the first place. That would just be ridiculous. I mean, it would ruin the scene of every movie, as it would have done here. It kind of defeats the purpose of creating a believable scene. Now, the answer to this one is a little bit more outside the box. And in 2001, Steve Troy of lunaranomalies.com managed to figure out, after lengthy investigation, that the letter C appearing on this rock here didn't actually appear on the rock itself on the moon. The letter you see here is actually just on the photograph. The same way you can see the crosshairs on the photograph, the letter here is just an anomaly on the actual photo itself. Because you can actually see on different transparencies from different sources connected with NASA here, you don't actually see this mark or this shape that looks like the letter C on the photo. This is only an error caused by one of their prints. And when this print was scanned and shared on the internet, well, guess what? This is the version that got spread around everywhere, and this version of the photograph obviously became famous for having this strange looking letter C on what seems to be a rock on the moon. But of course, as you know now, this letter C is only present on the actual photograph itself from a dodgy print originating in the Lunar and Planetary Institution in Houston. And after being studied further under a microscope, it was found that it was indeed just a hair or some kind of fiber that ended up on the photographic paper. So yeah, I'd say this one has been thoroughly debunked. And now for the strange and unexplainable shadow angles we see in the photos. Well, allegedly unexplainable, of course. And now for the strange inconsistency in the length of the astronauts' shadows. Let's explain this one. Or let's see if we can explain it, just to give the conspiracy theorists a fair chance here. Because, hey, as far as we know, they've still got a legitimate conspiracy to hold on to, because we haven't debunked everything yet. Well, that's not really how science works, but we'll play along for now. In their minds, the different lengths of shadows points to studio lights being used, obviously because Hollywood and all that. So, let's see if we can debunk this one. I've got some bad news, not surprisingly, for you conspiracy theorists, that we can reject the multiple light source theory without much difficulty whatsoever. You see, the two astronauts are closely in line with each other with respect to the light source. A light set to illuminate one could hardly avoid illuminating the other. This would cause each astronaut to cast two shadows, one from each light source. So, definitely not multiple light sources then. Okay then, but what about the lengths? How do you explain that? Well, this one requires a bit more thought, it seems. Upon closer inspection of the photo, we can see that the foreground of the image is a bit darker than the background. And this indicates that the terrain isn't actually level at all. The ground slopes downhill away from the camera to roughly the center of the image, and then begins to slope upwards again and receives more direct sunlight. And if you look at this diagram here, you can see the behavior of the objects casting shadows on variously sloping surfaces. And as you can see, despite the two cylinders being the same height, they are on different sides of the shallow depression. Their shadows are different lengths because of their positions and because of the slope. And this actually wouldn't happen with multiple light sources. So yeah, this, if anything, proves that they had to have had only one light source. And now the thing about parallel shadows. Once again, shadows rarely ever appear parallel to our eyes or to a camera. They very rarely actually appear parallel. Even if they are actually locally parallel, the shadows will appear to be converging from your perspective low to the ground. I mean, this is seen on Earth as well in daylight. Take a photo of any rocks you want. Your shadow and the rock's shadow will appear to be converging, even if they're actually parallel. Or look at sun rays shining through some clouds. They're all parallel to each other. But from the ground, from your perspective, they appear to be diverging or spreading out when they're not. It's all just a matter of perspective, of course, which is all very easy to test and find out for yourself in the real world. And now, as you can see in this photo here, the reflected sunlight bouncing off the moon's surface is enough to illuminate the astronauts somewhat, but more importantly in this photo here specifically, you can clearly see a slight golden tint in the enhanced photo, and this golden tint is actually from the lunar module, Eagle. And this thing is designed to reflect about 50% of the light that hits it. So it's pretty obvious where all this extra light's coming from, and where all those extra shadows are coming from as well. Unlike regular antennas that we're used to seeing every day, these antennas are actually not metal tubes. They are in fact just flat metal strips painted white on one side and black on the other. So, where they're seen edge on, for example in this picture here, it tends to disappear against the black background. But when you see it from the side and you see the white side of it, you can obviously see it. So once again, it's a matter of perspective. The confusion caused by this one is somewhat understandable, but once again, it's very easily explained away using some very simple analysis of the actual context in the images. Okay, let's start by comparing both images. As you can see, it appears as if the mountain changes size, and yes, this is in fact the same mountain. Well, the answer to this one is, once again, kind of simple. It's basically just got to do with the way the image is cropped. One image is cropped more closely than the other, and then enlarged to the same height as the wider shot. So this produces an illusion of the mountain being different heights. The photos have essentially been cropped and resized. So we can see using this grid here just how much more the image has been enlarged compared to the scale of the photo on the left. And you can see that the mountain is in fact the same size if you look at the grid. Here's another photo for comparison. Here we can see that they are not cropped, and it's more obvious that it's the exact same mountain and it's the exact same size in the uncropped images. And here you can see the images superimposed, where you can see that, yep, that mountain is definitely the same size, except for a minor camera tilt. Of course, the fact that it's really hard to actually judge distances on the moon doesn't really help, as it has no atmosphere and no other landmarks or notable features. It's just a sea of grey dust, so it can be really difficult to actually judge sizes. If we look at a similar situation of mountains being photographed on Earth, we'll immediately spot that yes, it's the same mountain and it's the same size, because you can compare the size of a feature on the mountain between photos, maybe a tree or a certain rock pattern or something of the sort. Point is, it's much easier to judge distances and sizes on Earth than it is on the moon, for obvious reasons. And unfortunately, the moon's lack of atmosphere means that you can't really judge depth, unlike on Earth, where you could use the haze of our atmosphere to sort of tell how far away something is. So despite this hill or mountain being kilometers away from the landing site, in one photo it looks like it's really close up. And when the camera is closer to the lunar module will look a lot bigger. When the camera is further away, the lunar module looks a lot smaller. But the size of the mountain doesn't change. So there you go. That's the explanation for this one. In one shot the camera is closer, the other shot the camera is further away. The size of the mountain doesn't change, but because of the lack of accurate depth cueing capabilities, because of the lack of atmosphere and the featureless surface of the moon, we can't really judge size and distance that well, simply because there are no other available cues other than the size of the rover. But using the rover alone to judge the size of the hill obviously doesn't make logical sense, and it would be obviously flawed on Earth. If you used the size of, let's say you took a photo of a car, and then one of the photos was really close up and zoomed in, and the other photo was taken from a distance, and the car had a mountain behind it that was kilometers away, you could immediately tell that only the size of the car, only the apparent size of the car had changed, and not the size of the mountain. because of things like atmospheric hazing and features on the mountain and in the surrounding areas that will give away the distance and size of the mountain and the car. Oh, I love this one, because it's a common example of people that don't know jack shit about radiation or how it works or what it is. It's the same kind of people that think that the scariest thing about a nuclear weapon is the radiation, or people that think that Chernobyl was this big tragic event that killed off half of Europe. It's quite common for people to not understand radiation and to be scared of it, of course. But sometimes I just can't help but mock these people, especially when they claim that radiation prevented us from going to the moon. This one is particularly stupid. I wonder how these people would react when they find out that light is radiation. This one is commonly used to just trick people that have no idea what radiation even is. And the explanation is that there are many different types of radiation, and the Van Allen belts in particular, that radiation is very, very easy to shield against. And of course, the biggest factor in radiation and protecting yourself from radiation is exposure time. Their exposure time would have been minimal. So, with some basic appropriate shielding and minor exposure time and planning the right route to the thinnest part of the Van Allen belts, the exposure would have been negligible. Absolutely negligible. I mean, most people don't even know that alpha radiation can be stopped by a piece of paper, and beta radiation can be stopped by a very thin sheet of foil. And the least ionizing form of radiation, gamma radiation, is the only one that can really penetrate through thicker materials. So even the spaceship hull itself would have provided more than enough protection against some high energy protons, which is exactly what the astronauts had to worry about. And the astronauts had plenty of time to heal from any amount of radiation damage, as after passing through the Southern Atlantic magnetic anomaly, they only spent about 4 hours there, followed by days of little to no exposure, which meant that their cells would have plenty of time to actually regenerate, which is what you need really. And of course the astronauts wore dosimeters to measure the actual exposure they received, and they would have known if they were receiving a lethal dose or dangerous dose of radiation. So there you have it. Absolute nonsense. Absolutely debunked. I forgot to mention, but a very popular one that you've probably all heard before is the question of why there are no stars in the sky, or why there are no stars visible in the sky. And you also get these kinds of questions when Earth is photographed from space. Well, people that ask these questions seem to fail to grasp the most basic concepts of photography. I mean, contrast. Yes, contrast. If any of you have actually tried to photograph stars from Earth on a clear night, you'll know that you'll have to have a really long exposure of the night sky. And that means that the surrounding landscape will be a lot brighter because the camera has to capture a lot more light. I mean, we see this effect with small scale photos here on Earth, but when you're trying to capture a picture of something as massive and as bright as the Earth, or as the surface of the moon, and also trying to capture faint, small, tiny little, almost microscopic lights in the sky from stars billions of light years away, or millions of light years away, or hundreds of light years away even, you're trying to capture their light as well as the massive bright object right in front of you. That's not going to work out too well, obviously. And this isn't even taking into consideration the fact that they're in direct sunlight, so the sun's light will automatically drown out the light of any visible stars. I mean, to think that NASA would mess up something this obvious, you know, accidentally, is just ridiculous, especially if they're staging such a massive conspiracy. The idea that they'd actually put out a massive mistake like this is idiotic, but yeah, we'll ignore that for now. There's just one more thing I'd like to talk about just before the video ends, and that is on Google's censorship. I mean, trying to research counterpoints or pro-conspiracy arguments for this video was probably one of the most difficult things I've had to research so far. I mean, seriously, trying to figure out the intricacies of a black hole was easier than finding some simple pro-lunar conspiracy arguments. If I look up, was the moon landing faked on Google, I want to see both sides equally. I want results given based on relevance to the search keywords. I don't want results that are being filtered out and rigged by Google, because I couldn't give less of a shit what Google thinks I should see or I should read. So for this video, I've had to use alternatives like DuckDuckGo, for example, just to find simple pro-lunar conspiracy arguments. As if half the internet doesn't believe the moon landing was faked already. It makes it look like no one believes the moon landing was faked. It's ridiculous to even ask that question. But in reality, it's not. The censorship is ridiculous, and it's real. Okay, you know what? I'll drop the act. I'll admit it. I was in fact paid by the US government to shill for NASA. I have to admit this, because deep down, we all know what the truth is. The moon is made of cheese. Oh shit. I think they found me.